I think we'll get started. Welcome to the July board meeting. First of all, I'd like to thank all the board members for rearranging your schedule. It just was no way possible we could have gone forward with the schedule of the meetings last week with the situation in flux at Long Island. So I know a lot of you make plans a long time in advance, and I sincerely appreciate your ability to revise your schedules accordingly. Mr. Morello, do we have any public speakers?
Mr. Chairman, we have 7 public speakers. I would ask that, as usual, we ask the speakers to observe the time limit on their comments. They'll be notified by bells and whistles when you reach the limit. Our first speaker is George Haikalis. He'll be followed by Nancy Montgomery.
Good afternoon. My name is George Haikalis, and it's a pleasure to be here. There's a statement being distributed which has an illustration at the top of the statement, and I hope everyone will take a quick look at that illustration while I'm speaking. I'm representing the Institute for Rational Urban Mobility, IRM. IRM urges MTA to reinvent its Long Island Railroad East Side Access project by halting all construction on its deep cavern plan and securing a design-build contractor to construct the upper-level loop alternative developed by the Delcan Corporation, Canada's largest engineering firm. Using existing tracks and platforms in Grand Central, the world's largest railway station avoids the risk of placing as many as 8,000 Long Island Railroad passengers in a deep cavern terminal 151 feet below Park Avenue in the event of a fire or terrorist attack. Using the upper level saves passengers 3 to 4 minutes of travel time in each direction and saves MTA the substantial cost of operating and maintaining 47 escalators. This reinvention effort should also include halting construction of a costly new yard for midday storage of rail cars in Sunnyside, Queens. By operating more frequent reverse peak service and returning rail cars to existing rail yards further east, there will be no need to build a new yard. This property is worth much more if sold as raw real estate, since developers would not have to build a costly deck over an operating rail yard. Remaking MTA's commuter railroads into a 21st century regional rail system with frequent service, integrated fares, and through running would better serve the region's changing demographics and transport needs. Thank you very much.
Next speaker is Nancy Montgomery, to be followed by Murray Bowden.
Good afternoon. Thank you for listening to me today. I didn't intend to come here to speak. I came here to listen and to try to understand. After 7 months of watching your meetings and scouring the materials on your website and being dissatisfied with my findings, I thought it was time to come and sit in the same room with you and get to work with you. I applaud President Giuletti's focus on safety. I was surprised that no board member questioned the President's memo dated July 14th. Were you satisfied with the quarterly June 19th stand down with a focus to the new general safety instructions and the focus on fatigue awareness? I didn't find that report. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you're satisfied with it. There seems to be a lot of focus on diversity and on-time trains, and that's all important. Those are very important issues, but we seem to get very quiet when we talk about safety. And I understand the concern for the on-time trains and your impatience at this ongoing issue. I'm impatient too, because it's been 6 years since Congress passed the Rail Improvement Safety Act. To the board members who still feel that safety first is just not going to wash, I suggest you resign. Make room for a board member who has some real expertise in safety and will not drag their feet and their heels in implementing this act of Congress. Again, I applaud everything that's been done in trying to get down to safety. It's not time to move on from that. We've been waiting since Congress passed that act in 2008 that would have addressed the fatigue awareness. We should just test for it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bowden. To be followed by Deborah Greif.
Three weeks ago on 60 Minutes, they interviewed Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote a book called David and Goliath. I went over and I downloaded it to my phone and I started reading it and I finished it in prompt time. It was fascinating how David, this little, about his size of Jonathan, I think. Hi. Yeah, but you're powerful. The point is, this is the modern equivalent of David's sling made out of, and a little rock goes in here, and in the hands of a slinger who goes around his head like this, it's as powerful as a 32 or 48 or 38 caliber revolver. He thought differently. He didn't put on armor. Goliath was like this, carrying 150, 200 pounds of armor with all kinds of battle equipment. And David only had a little sling with a rock. But because he was a shepherd and he had to protect his sheep, he knew how to kill a lion with a rock. And he took down Goliath because he was willing to do things somewhat differently. I've been to all the meetings here today, and what I've said at most of them was, you have to think a little differently, fellas. You can't do it the way you always did it. That's an interesting little light you have there, because at the Port Authority on Wednesday, they had the equivalent. And I invoked a transportation emergency because I had described an airplane coming into their airport who ran out of gas because the pilot did not declare a fuel emergency and crashed out on Long Island. Mitch, you know where that plane crashed, right? Because he didn't declare an emergency. I am declaring a transportation emergency because they're buying railroad cars that are not proper, because Bridge and Tunnel is not putting lines on a road that are not proper, because they're putting signs up there that are not informative.
Could you wrap up, please, Mr. Bowden?
I'm sorry?
Could you wrap up, please?
That's an issue. Do you do things the way you've always done them, or do you begin to do them differently? I'm here to challenge you, many of you, to do things differently, because doing them the old way didn't work. It's a new world. Cell phones, social media, those books are outmoded. I downloaded the book on my phone while I was waiting. Now, I apologize, Tom, for kind of breaking the rules a little bit. But sometimes you have to break the rules to make a point.
Deborah Greif will be followed by Rosalie Norton. Sorry, Norton.
Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Greif. I am the chairperson of the Brooklyn Family Support Service Advisory Council. I represent families in Brooklyn who have children with developmental disabilities, and I represent Brooklyn and Albany. I'm asking something that to myself and all the families I represent, as well as the Brooklyn Developmental Center. 5 years ago, our transportation woes kind of ended because to get to the developmental center, it took many times more than 2 to 3 hours because we only had one bus, the B13, that would make all these circles into a post office that we weren't allowed to go into if we needed the restroom. And if you missed the bus, you prayed that it would come back in 20 minutes, but it never did. So then we finally had a great big meeting at the Brooklyn Developmental Center, and MTA was there, and I thank everybody that was there. Mr. Chris Lake, he was great. And we explained that it wasn't a want, it was a need. Because you see, a lot of individuals live in the Spring Creek Towers, and it was until the B83 went across the Bell Parkway did everybody finally, both sides of the community had true access to each other. Instead of taking 1 hour, you could see the towers from Fountain Avenue, but it took you more than an hour to get there by public transportation. So what I'm asking is to please do not change the route. meet with us in that area so that we can show you and work out something that'll be good for everyone. Also, please extend the evening B82 limited. I'd like to be able to go home in 45 minutes instead of 2 hours at nighttime. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rosalie Norton. She'll be followed by Patty McDonald.
I want to thank the board for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you. West Hempstead has not had weekend service on the West Hempstead branch for the last 4 years. A lot has happened within our community, West Hempstead, to perhaps urge you and make you understand the necessity of that weekend service to the viability of some of our businesses and how they could succeed. Now, I've been here 3 times, and all I could say, I'm not going to repeat all of the things that are there, the testimony that you've had before. I'm not going to take your time with that, but hope that you will restore that service, and that being here 3 times is sort of like, they say 3 times is a charm, and I hope you do vote to restore it.
Thank you very much. Mayor McDonald. And then finally, Christopher Greif.
Hi, good afternoon. Also, I'd like to say thank you very much for allowing me to speak, echoing what Rosalie Norton just said, that we would like to see the weekend service come back to the village of Malvern. As I had stated at one of the meetings back in April, that the weekend service, it's not just the weekend service. What happens is when there's a snowstorm, you go to weekend service, holidays or a weekend service. So therefore, relatives that want to come out to the village to meet and entertain and celebrate with their families are unable to do that. So I just urge the board, please, to reinstate the weekend service. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Our final speaker, Christopher Greif.
Good afternoon. I'm Christopher D. Greif, member of New York City Transit Riders Council member and people with development disabilities. As I'm just going to be mentioning is, as the new Gateway Mall is being built in Brooklyn, and as Deborah Greif, Chair of the Advisory Council, has spoken already before, we are concerned of safety issues in the area of that area due to the fact the 83 bus was the only bus that ran during the later nights. The last one was almost at 1 o'clock in the morning, and the first one was at 4:30 in the morning. There was no Q8, no 13, or no B84 do not run during that time. Now with this 83 bus now going to the Gateway Mall 2, it is now going to be difficult for our employees to get to their destinations safely and concernedly. We are worried about their safety getting to their place. There was nothing to discuss with us, and I hope we can do I hope we can meet soon, very soon. The other issue is as the other concern is, we hope we can get the B51 bus back on the Manhattan Bridge, the B71 bus along Union Avenue, going to Whole Foods, because as you know, it's been very busy, that part of Brooklyn, and I hope we do get the M104 bus back along 42nd Street. We do have a lot of people with developmental disabilities do go to the doctors along that street, and the M42 bus has been reaching a lot of people with disabilities and seniors. Since we cannot use the 42nd Street shuttle, and sometimes the 7 train does not operate sometimes on weekends because of track work, we're asking for the M104 bus to please come back. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mr. Greif. Mr. Chairman, that concludes the public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Morello. Good afternoon, everyone. We have already had a very long day here, and I'm sure people are tired, so I'll be brief with my opening remarks. I'd first like to have all of you join me in a cordial welcome for our 2 newest board members, Iris Weinschall and Neil Zuckerman, sitting to my left. Iris, as many of you know, is Vice Chancellor of City University and was recently named Chief Operating Officer of the New York Public Library effective September 1st. In addition to other prominent roles she has played in government, Iris is a former New York City Department of Transportation Commissioner. Neil is a business executive and management consultant, and like myself, he is a Metro-North commuter, and he will represent the Metro-North Commuter Council. Last month, we were joined by City Transportation Commissioner Polly Trottenberg, and not too long before that, welcomed John Malloy, who was selected by the Nassau County Executive. Like Polly and John and members all before us, you will find that serving on the board is true public service. In other words, lots of time, hard work, and responsibility. But I know you will make contributions that will make a difference, and I welcome you to the board. Thank you very much. The minutes of June's meeting have been distributed to all members. Are there any corrections or omissions? If not, may I have a motion to approve?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Committee on Finance, the first report is to Mr. Ferrer, who will report on the Finance Committee.
Mr. Chairman, Finance Committee met earlier today. There are 4 action items on the agenda for board approval. The first action item is to adopt the bond resolution authorizing special obligation taxable refunding bond series 2014. The second action item is to approve the addition of outside counsel to the approved panel. Next action item is the approval of the MTA 2010-2014 capital plan amendment. The last item is the approval of the proposed amendment to the MTA Bridges and Tunnels Sandy repair portion of the MTA 2010-2014 capital plan. The committee recommends these action items, and I move them.
Any questions and comments? All those in favor?
Aye. There are 7 procurement actions this month in the total amount of $71.3 million. There are no non-competitive procurements. There are 6 competitive procurements in the amount of $70.70 million. These procurements include the IBM staff summary distributed to board members. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Second. Any comments or questions? All in favor? Aye.
There was 1 ratification in the amount of $567,000. The committee recommends this ratification, and I move it.
Second. Any comments or questions? All those in favor? Aye.
And there are 3 real estate action items which are described on pages 100 through 107 of the board book distributed for this meeting. The committee recommends these real estate items, and I move them.
Second. Any comments or questions? All in favor? Aye.
Mr. Chairman, that concludes the Finance Committee report.
Could I just add something on real estate? 1 second?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. In view of our discussions last month regarding the Penn Station, Grand Central Station situation, I found it very interesting that in watching television the last month, NYU Langone Medical Center took the opportunity to showcase the world's most famous railroad station. I could have sworn it was Penn Station. The lady with the violin and the man with the clarinets playing in the middle of the area there, which I have now seen at least 30 times on TV in the last month, if nothing else, showcased why there's a significant difference between Grand Central and Penn Station. And once again, in view of the fact that the Port Authority just earmarked $90 million for the Port Authority bus terminal, which maybe ties Penn Station for its lack of amenities these days, I would once again urge this board and Amtrak and others to look at Penn Station again. We need to do something. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We now have another report from Mr. Ferrer, Transit and Bus Committee.
Mr. Chairman, the Transit and Bus Committee met earlier and reports the following. There are 2 action items for this month. The first action item authorizes the addition of 2 new projects to the 2010-2014 capital program, providing ADA accessibility to 3 stations on the Sea Beach and West End lines. The second action item approves the implementation of a new bus route, the BX24, to serve Hutchinson Metro Center. The committee recommends these action items, and I move them.
Second. Any comments or questions? All in favor?
There are 12 procurement actions this month in the total amount of $138 million. There is 1 non-competitive procurement for MTA New York City Transit in the amount of $6 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Second. Any comments or questions? All in favor?
There are 9 competitive procurements in the total amount of $129 million. 8 procurements are for New York City Transit in the amount of $127 million, and 1 for MTA Capital Construction in the amount of $2 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Second. Comments or questions? All in favor? Aye.
There are 2 ratifications in the total amount of $3 million. One ratification is for New York City Transit in the amount of $900,000, and one ratification is for MTA Capital Construction in the amount of $2.1 million. The committee recommends these ratifications, and I move them.
Any comments or questions? All in favor? Aye.
Mr. Chairman, this concludes the Transit and Bus Committee report.
Mr. Sador, please deliver the Metro North Committee report.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. The Metro North Committee met. What's the following? There are 7 procurement items in a total amount of $65.2 million. There are 2 non-competitive procurements totaling $51.1 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Second? Any comments or questions? All in favor? Aye.
There are 5 competitive procurements in the amount of $14 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Second? Comments, questions? All in favor? Aye.
There are no ratifications. This concludes the report of the Metro North Railroad Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Sador. Mr. Pally, please, the Long Island Railroad Committee report.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. The Long Island Railroad Committee met this month. I report the following. There are 6 procurement items in the total amount of $10.7 million. There is 1 non-competitive procurement in the amount of $2.4 million. The committee recommends this procurement, and I move it.
Second? Any comments, questions? All in favor?
Aye. There are 5 competitive procurements, 3 for Long Island Railroad in the amount of $93,000, and 2 for MTA Capital Construction in the total amount of $8.1 million. The committee recommends these procurements, and I move them.
Second?
Second.
Any comments or questions? All in favor?
Aye.
There are no ratifications, and this concludes the report of the Long Island Railroad Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Pally. Mr. Capelli, Bridge and Tunnels Committee report, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Bridges and Tunnels met earlier and report the following. There are 9 procurements in the total amount of $68.407 million. There are no non-competitive procurements. The Telvent USA LLC procurement and the BCC Associates Inc. procurement were tabled at the request of the committee and will be submitted to the committee and the board at a later date with additional information as requested. There are 7 remaining competitive procurements in the total amount of $8.7 million. Committee members who were present at the committee meeting considered and voted in favor of these 7 procurement items, although a committee quorum was not present. I move that the board approve the recommended procurements.
Second? Any comments or questions? All in favor?
Aye.
There are no ratifications, and this concludes Bridges and Tunnels report, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Capelli. Mr. Malloy, report from the Diversity Committee.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. The Diversity Committee met earlier, and I have the following to report. There is 1 action item on the agenda for board approval. The action item is to approve MTA's overall 3-year DBE goal at 17% for federal fiscal years 2015 through 2017. This is the same DBE goal as currently exists for 12 through 14. The committee recommends this action item, and I move it.
Second? Any comments or questions? All in favor?
Aye.
This concludes the Diversity Committee report.
Thank you, Mr. Malloy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're now going to have a report on the July financial plan. Bob Ferran, our Chief Financial Officer, is going to deliver a detailed presentation, but before he does so, I'd like to make a few remarks. This is the 2nd mid-year plan over which I've presided since being nominated to chair the MTA. It doesn't get any easier. In the lead up to this process, we ask agency presidents to look ahead, to set aggressive goals, to prioritize needs, and to look at how to cut or contain costs, and to make the hard choices and to sometimes make compromises. The board will consider the same approaches, looking at cost trends, revenue projects, and the resources we need to continue to deliver safe and reliable service throughout all of our MTA agencies. Since the MTA's financial crisis in 2009, the implementation of a new structure for the state's contributions to our operating budget and the painful cuts in service totaling some $90 million that were made in 2010 and were necessary at the time Our management and board have worked very hard at finding the resources to restore or expand resources whenever the demand warranted. In the prior 2 years alone, we've been able to add $47.5 million to the budget and to restore and expand services. In the upcoming budget, we have identified $20 million to continue that effort. These are important dollars, and I know our customers will appreciate the service. However, I caution against anyone focusing too much attention on that one element of the budget because it is only one element of a very comprehensive and detailed budget. The larger and more important elements are as follows. The plan is balanced. It fits within our revenue projections. It will accommodate recent collective bargaining agreements without necessitating any increases in fares or tolls beyond those which had already been prescribed in our financial plan. We continue to reduce costs and are on a trajectory of our current annual recurring costs of $1.1 billion in the current year, rising to $1.5 billion in 2017, a commitment made by my two predecessors that we will continue to meet. Because of our rigor in cost control and budget discipline, we maintain a fund in pay-go spending for capital, basically a down payment on the 2015 through 19 capital plan, which we will be presenting to Albany in the fall. Since 1982 and the first capital program that Dick Ravage got, this has been a cornerstone of the MTA and important to its revitalization. We must maintain it. That plan will be absolutely critical to maintaining the state of good repair for our billions in assets, almost $1 trillion worth of assets, and delivering safe and reliable service as we plan for the regional transit needs for the immediate future and the long-term future to come. I will now turn the presentation over to Bob Ferran, our Chief Financial Officer, who will be making a joint presentation to both the board and the finance committees. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In front of you, you have 3 items. You have a staff summary. The staff summary includes certain action items that will be taken. The chairman will present them at the end of the discussion following the financial plan presentation, and also Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the July financial plan. Let's start by looking back at the February plan to see where we were. In February, we were projecting small cash balances in 2014 and 2016, and a projected deficit of $255 million in 2017. Just to orient you to this, if we were to break even, you would have results right on the zero line in the middle of the page. What we were projecting for this year is a cash balance of about $64 million. And as we do in our finances, the $64 million cash balance projected for the end of the year will roll over and be applied against expenses in the next year, 2015, to basically give us a break-even projection. That small cash balance is rolled over into 2016. Again, a very small, basically a break-even. That small amount of cash balance will still roll over into 2017 and slightly reduce the deficit that we're projecting. The February plan was based on 5 key interrelated elements. First, there were 3 years of net zero labor settlements for all MTA unions. Secondly, we had annually recurring cost savings targets of $1.1 billion in 2014, rising to $1.5 billion in 2017. We were projecting fare and toll increases in 2015 and 2017 of 4% each time, roughly 2% a year, the rate of inflation. It is based upon the assumption that there would be no further legislative erosion in our payroll mobility tax. And as the chairman also mentioned, we have a significant amount of pay-as-you-go funding, $370 million, as a down payment for the 2015 to 2017, or excuse me, 19 capital program. Now, as we stated in February, failure to achieve either of the first 2 elements, that is the 3 net zeros or the annually recurring cost savings, or any significant decrease in the amount of PMT or other dedicated taxes or subsidies, would put pressure on fares or tolls and also would hit the pay-as-you-go. Well, while we're on track to achieve our savings targets, based on current and recent labor settlements and labor agreements, it's clear now that the 3 net zeros are unachievable. What else has changed since the February plan? Well, we have both positives and negative things that have occurred. On the positive side, the favorable, we've had re-estimates that are lower for health and welfare costs or retiree health care costs. We have lower debt service. Energy costs are coming in lower than we had estimated. Our pension expenses also are lower than we thought. Higher passenger and toll revenues. We have higher paratransit savings. As you know, that's one of the fastest growing areas in our budget, and I think the Transit Authority has done a remarkable job of working to keep those costs as low as possible while still meeting our federal mandate. We have higher real estate receipts projected for this year, but lower receipts projected in the out years. It looks like we're probably going to have about $152 million more in real estate revenues this year, primarily the real property transfer tax. But those are individual transactions that we receive 1% of the proceeds as a tax. When we look to see the general base and to project on that base, we're about $30 million lower each year. We do have a favorable silver lining, if you would, relative to East Side Access. Because East Side Access start date or opening date has been pushed back, it does mean that the operating costs that we have to ramp up are being pushed back as well, so they won't hit us as soon. We had lower spending in 2013, and so we have a favorable variance that carries over. On the unfavorable factors, lower payroll mobility tax. We're expecting about $52 million less this year, about $66 million less the next year, 77 and 86 million as you go out. So lower payroll mobility tax. We are having higher overtime. There'll be a presentation in the September board meeting where each of the agencies will talk about what they need to do to control certain overtime. I just point out that other overtime is valuable. It's important for operations. And also at this time when we do have significant investments going in to meet some of the safety needs or the maintenance needs, overtime is certainly something that we're willing to invest. You're going to see significant investments in safety, about $360 million through the plan period, additional operation and maintenance investments, and additional service investments and customer enhancements. If you take all of the positives, you take all of the negatives, you net them together, we're projecting about $635 million net favorable results through 2017. However, the labor settlements. The actual and assumed labor settlements, both for the TWU Local 100 and other unions, and the potential settlements that we're seeing as a result of the leadership of the Long Island Railroad Union Coalition, if those were implemented, and again, those unions that typically follow the pattern, it would increase our labor costs by a minimum of $1.3 billion during that period, 2017. So the net of the two is we're looking at an unfavorable situation of about $645 million through 2017. By reallocating existing resources that we had that had been earmarked for other expenses, we'll be able to offset this increase in our labor cost without having to raise fares and tolls above that which is currently projected and minimize the impact on our pay-as-you-go capital. Let's look at these labor costs, incremental labor costs, a little more in depth. The depth of the bar on the page in front of you shows the increased cost since the February plan of the assumed labor settlements. The top of the bar, there's a white box. That's the total of the two bars, both the blue and the red. The blue assumes that every single one of our unions followed the TWU Local 100 pattern. So if every one of our unions, including the commuter rail unions, followed the TWU pattern, the cost would have been $348 million through 2014, and I point out that that includes some retroactive payments. And then you can see going forward about 245, 208, 7 ongoing. However, we have reached an agreement with the leadership of the Long Island Railroad Union Coalition, and if that became the pattern for all of our commuter railroads, it would increase the cost through 2014 by $130 million and then roughly $48 million a year thereafter. So that's the total of what we think the incremental labor cost will be versus what we had in our financial plan back in February. Well, how do we plan on offsetting those incremental costs? Well, this is the proposal. We are going to reallocate certain expenditures, and using those reallocated expenditures, that'll relieve pressure that otherwise would have to fall to the fares and tolls or significantly on the pay-as-you-go capital. The depth of the bars are the same as on the prior chart. 478, 293, so it's the same numbers that you saw from the prior chart. Here we're just showing how we'll close it. So the first thing we'll do is we have had, as I said, some favorable budget re-estimates. And so we'll be able to use those and apply them against the incremental cost. So you can see in the gold, $172 million of benefit through 2014, $84 million the next year, 29, 22, and a small amount of $6 million in 2018. But the next item is where we will use monies that we have previously set aside for OPEBs. That's other post-employment benefits. It's primarily retiree health care cost. We are not required to set money aside as if it were a pension plan for these future costs. We have, with the board's instructions, been setting aside monies for this purpose. Right now we have $300 million in a trust, and we have about $400 million in a reserve held by our treasurer. We're proposing that we take roughly $250 million out of our reserve and apply it through these cumulative costs through 2014. Then the contribution that we would make this year into the trust or into the reserve, we won't make that, and we'll apply that against the higher labor costs. So that's roughly $52 million that would be applied in 2014, and then as you can see, 109, 118, 127, and 127. There is a small area in green. We have a pension plan for the Long Island Railroad that's a supplemental or an additional pension plan. It's a closed pension plan. No new employees are going into it, and as the workforce retires, they'll be covered by this plan or receive benefits from the plan. It is our lowest funded pension plan. And what we have been doing is trying to put additional resources, when those are available, into that plan to reduce the unfunded balance. Basically, if we put money aside into that plan, it reduces our cost in the future because we have more money earning an interest rate that saves us money. To give you a perspective, we pay about $120 million a year into that plan. $20 million of it is current cost, $100 million is for older employees who've retired. So we have a long way to go to cover that. Putting money aside reduces those costs. In the last, I'd say 12 months, we have put significant monies aside, and it looks like we'll have about $240 million set aside in that plan, which will reduce our unfunded liability by about 18%. So we have been approaching it, but at this point in time, we're saying let's just take those dollars and use it to reduce the impact of this incremental labor settlement. Finally, the last thing that we have available to us is pay-as-you-go funding. As we said earlier, or showed earlier, we have $370 million a year beginning in 2015 that we've set aside. We'll take $80 million of that and use it to offset the higher cost. Let's hit the highlights of the July plan. First, as you just saw, it funds the TWU Local 100 and the Long Island Railroad Union Coalition proposed and actual settlements. And it does it from the favorable re-estimates. It does it from the OPEB reserves. It eliminates the supplemental pension, and it reduces pay-go. I will just point out that even though we're using monies from our OPEBs, we'll still have about $450 million set aside if we implement this plan. The July plan maintains fares and tolls increases, projected increases, I should say, in 2015 and 2017 of 4%. It still provides pay-go capital contributions in 2015 to 2019 at a level of $290 million, which if we were to bond against that, it would generate about $5.4 billion of funding for our 15 to 19 capital program. So a substantial amount of money still remains available to us. It invests $363 million in safety initiatives, $125 million in additional O&M, $20 million in additional service and service enhancement, and that's in addition to the $5 million that we have from service or from guideline changes. We continue the annually recurring savings targets. We expect to hit $1.3 billion in 2015, and increasing to over $1.5 billion by 2017. And this plan eliminates the deficit in the year 2017 and reduces the 2018 deficit to $262 million. Let's look quickly at some of the safety investments. The MTA is going to be making safety investments based on new mandates, recommendation by governmental bodies, compliance with existing laws, policies and procedures, and new MTA initiatives, such as those supporting the Vision Zero mayoral initiative. Investments are going to be taking place in the following categories: customer and employee safety, a significant amount of money, about $40 million a year. We really want to continue to promote and get people focused on a culture of developing and adopting a culture of safety. And it's through work rule practice changes and investment in technology and equipment. This would include audio-visual cameras in both the locomotive cabs as well as in passengers. It would be the outward and inward focusing in the cab, focused cameras in the cab. We have significant track work going. It's more frequent track inspection and repairs. At Metro North, they'll be implementing an autonomous track geometry measurement system and acquiring a track geometry vehicle. We'll be upgrading and repairing signals and signal systems. Significant investment in training of all of our employees. We have in our capital budget, or will have in our capital budget, about $914 million for positive train control. This is the operating cost associated with that we have. We'll be enhancing system safety and communications with our customers' employees, and there'll be more aggressive inspection and maintenance on the right-of-way. In total, $363 million of safety investments through the plan period. In terms of the service and service quality investments, $20 million, $13.5 at New York City Transit, and this is going for two key initiatives to improve response times and reduce service delays. They are establishing 4 CAT teams, combined action teams, and these are workers that have both track, signals, and third rail experience. So when we have a service disruption, the teams will be dispatched to go through, find out what the problem is, and be able to implement those changes or determine what needs to be done much more quickly. And for this team, it's really the PM rush is the key. There's another 4-person rapid transit signal system along the Lexington line. That will enable us to respond more quickly for both the AM and the PM rush. There's an expanded J-Line weekend service to Broad Street, additional bus connections for the Staten Island Ferry, additional bus service to the Gateway 2 Mall in Brooklyn, new select bus service on 2 routes that will be determined in conjunction with the city DOT, and that would go in place in 2015. With Long Island Railroad, it's a restoration of the bi-hourly weekend service on the West Hempstead branch, extend hourly weekend service between Babylon and Patchogue to year-round, extend the seasonal weekend service to Montauk by 10 weeks, restore 1 weekend round trip on Oyster Bay branch, and increase capacity by adding cars on Ronkonkoma, Port Washington, Hempstead, Huntington, and Babylon lines, and improving signage at Penn Station and outline stations. On Metro North, we'll be adding a new midday train from Hoboken to Middletown, and then there's going to be a pilot program for 1 year where we'll reduce daily parking fees and annual permit fees west of Hudson. And the objective there is to see whether by reducing the cost of commuting, we can try to recapture some of the lost ridership that we've seen in the west of Hudson line. I think we all recognize that it's really important that if we're going to have credibility with our customers, if we're going to have credibility with our funding partners, we've got to show that we are continuing to try to reduce cost anywhere we can. If we can't be efficient, it's a question, why should we be seeking more money from them? So what this chart shows is the increasing targets for savings that we've established for ourselves at each of the July plans. The bottom line there, the blue line, is the targets that we set with the July plan in 2011. We were to hit 400 million in 10, it was to increase, and by the time we got to 2015, it was a little over 800 million was the target. In July of 2012, that plan, the red line, we increased those targets again. For the July plan 2013, the green line, you can see that we've increased those targets as well. And now currently the targets that we have with this plan are at the top in the blue line. And that again is where we're targeting over $1.5 billion annual recurring savings. Now, in the February plan, if you recall, we said that we were proposing to take the 2015 and the 2017 fare and toll increase that had been scheduled or had been projected at 7.5%, and we were reducing those down to 4%. Well, that clearly comes at a cost. There's revenue loss there. So we proposed increasing our savings targets by 50 million in 2014, 100 million in 2015, 150 million in 2016, and 200 million in 2017. At that time, we weren't sure where we would be saving the money. They were unidentified savings targets. Well, what this chart shows is with the dark purple, those are savings initiatives that we both identified and that we've already implemented. So they're in place, and we'll just follow the pattern or the path to see those savings achieved. The purple hash are areas where we have identified the initiative, but we haven't implemented it yet. So implementation is still before us. The yellow is the unidentified savings targets. And as you can see, they're relatively minor on the front end. They do still remain at about 137, 114 as you get out there. But relative to the savings targets, which are in the white boxes at the bottom of each bars, they're pretty minor. So where are we now? This chart shows in the hashed green and red bars what the operating results look like or were projected to be in the February plan. The solid green and solid red bars are what we're now projecting in the July plan. You can see that where we were projecting a $64 million cash balance at the end of the year, now we're looking at 162 cash balance. That money rolls over, is used to offset expenses in 2015, and we're still, with higher expenses, we're still basically at a break-even, $10 million. 2016, we're projecting $146 million of cash balance. That will roll over into 2017. We've eliminated the deficit in 2017. We have a cash balance of 113 projected there, and then that will roll over to reduce the deficit that we're projecting now in 2018. What's our strategy moving forward? Well, first we're going to continue to pursue efficiencies and consolidations wherever we can so that we can keep increasing the annually recurring cost savings. We just have to keep doing that. And we have to maintain strong cost control, because the last thing we want to do is backslide. We've achieved savings. If we don't focus on them, we could easily lose those savings and see our costs creep up again. While this funding the labor, the incremental labor, caused us to temporarily divert some of our attention away from addressing long-term liabilities and long-term costs, we're still committed to achieving those reductions. And although the July plan suspends OPEB contributions through 2017, we are starting the contributions again in 2018, albeit at a lower level. But if our finances improve, it certainly is our intent to try to, wherever possible, increase funding OPEBs. We want to continue to do what the board authorized us to do in the February plan, to use non-recurring revenues, favorable budget variances, and the unused general reserve at the end of the year to reduce long-term liabilities, like the OPEBs, like the additional pension for Long Island Railroad, or simply for pay-as-you-go capital to avoid having to sell debt. Simply put, the goal here is to take revenues that may be one-shot revenues and try to translate them or turn them into recurring savings that give us an ongoing benefit. And the last thing we have here is we intend, when possible, through interest rate savings or refundings and things like that to take debt service savings and reinvest them into the capital program. We just think it's important to take advantage of those and see if we can get our pay-as-you-go and other funding sources back up. Mr. Chairman, that concludes the presentation.
I'll open it up to any comments or questions any of the board members may have.
Chairman?
Mr. Kelly?
Two issues. First of all, obviously on Long Island in the last couple of weeks or last week and a half, there's been a lot of discussion relating to the effect of the Long Island Railroad settlement on fares and tolls. And I think it's important to make clear that while the settlement has no additional impact on fares and tolls, it will not change, or at the moment does not plan on changing, the 4% increase in fares and tolls which have been incorporated into our 5-year plan and are intended at the moment, absent other extenuating circumstances, in March of 2015 and March of 2017. I think that issue has gotten somewhat mixed up on the island, and it's my understanding from the presentation that while there will be no additional effect, it does not minimize the importance of those tolls and fare increases in the first place. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct. That's correct. And the terminology we have used is the collective bargaining agreements have provided no additional pressure to the fares and tolls. But you summarized it very well. I mean, that's why we have the 6-month review at the halfway mark of the year. We will present the initial look at the budget for 2015 in November, voted on in December. But your summary is exactly correct.
One other issue. There was a discussion in Bob's presentation about OPEB and the additional Long Island Railroad pension plan and PAYGO funding. And we seem to be affecting all three of them in some fashion in this reformulation. The question is, would it be better, or is it a better alternative, or is there an alternative, because of the importance of the capital plan, that we not affect the PAYGO money for the next 4 years and do not take the $80 million that is in the plan to come out of that, but instead take it out of the other two sources that, while in the long term that may not be as helpful, in the short term, the 2015 to 2019 plan, that will give us more flexibility with the capital plan.
The amount for the additional pension plan, we're using all the money that we have in the budget, so that is expended.
Right.
So there's no extra. And what we could do on the OPEB, we're using all of the current or the projected annual monies. It would just be taking more out of the reserve. Now, we have $150 million in that reserve. There's $300 million in the trust, but you can't touch the trust, for anything else. So you could do that, but you'd be taking a one-time revenue and
how much do we have in the pension plan, not including current allocations?
I think the pension plan, we had about $225 million, I think, is the beginning of 13, and I think we put $240 million into the additional plan. So somewhere we've got about 480.
Right. Okay, so we have 480, 450, whatever it is. It's a substantial amount of money.
Yes.
It could, if we wanted to go backwards, substitute for the $80 million we are taking out each year for the next 4 years out of PAYGO.
Yes.
It is an option.
It
I'm
is.
not arguing for or against it, but I think it is something we should look at as to the benefits and consequences of both actions, because we all fully understand the importance of the next capital plan, both in relation to safety and state of good repair. And to me, that is more important than an allocation that we have made in the past when we had the opportunity to do so for a purpose that we are not using in the current time period.
Right. It certainly is. You could use it either way. One way you'd look at it going forward, avoiding debt, okay, we're avoiding our interest rate, and our interest rate basically is less than 4% right now. We're projecting higher numbers just because we look at forward curves. To the money that's going into the pension, because our actually assumed rate of return is 7%, putting money there, we reduce our future contributions by that 7%. So there is a mathematical economic analysis that you could do that would say, if the same dollar in one case can help me to avoid 4% or 5% of an interest rate, but can help me avoid a 7% rate of return assumption, I'd rather put it in the 7% avoidance, which then frees revenues that I could then bond against. So you're absolutely right. The decision could be made to use monies different ways, but we try to look at it in terms of what's the highest return on investment for us.
Can I?
But we certainly will. That's something we look at.
Okay. Can I just, to follow on what Mitch just said, two questions. Do you all have any specifics, Bob, on, capital funding capacity is reduced by 1.5 billion, what that looks like? Like, what's the list of things? And then, on the pension side, you're saying actuarial rate of return of 7%, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a 7% rate of return.
I'd like to respond to part of it. First of all, we could certainly do that, Mitch. But Mr. Kay's not here, but he has eloquently at a number of different board meetings talked about the fact that it is very important that in the sale of the capital program, and in answer to your second question, which is how would that impact, we'll find out as we have these briefings over the next month and a half and bring forward to the board a proposed plan for 15 through 19. So we'll see exactly what that 1.5 billion, what some of the projects could be affected. The pay-as-you-go capital comes from fair revenues. It comes from fare box primarily.
And PMT, yes.
And PMT. And, the capital program has a number of stakeholders that need to belly up to the bar and be able to support it, both at a state level and a city level. And while I agree, Mitch, if you're down to your last day and you need to make sure that you have the appropriate money to take care of state of good repair needs, we will do what we have to do. That's what our fiduciary responsibility is. But to put that up front too soon and take the pressure off those who actually need to be able to bring money to support whole life asset management for $1 trillion asset, I think it's very important that we be careful in terms of when we have that dialogue. But I agree with you. We have that within our purview to be able to do that. Mr. Capelli.
Well, first of all, Tom, I thank you for just saying what you said, because that is music to my ears. I've been it's been a very ugly year in terms of this whole process, and I commend yourself and Bob and the others for getting us to a point where we're essentially still alive as a transportation agency, despite having had multiple challenges thrown at us. And while I was very optimistic in the beginning of the year, having seen what occurred had me concerned as to where we would be today. So first let me deal with the issue of service investments that are in the plan. And the optimist in me is at least happy that we're able to do $20 million this year, and for the third year in a row, we're telling we're telling the people who are our riders that we understand that there are things that we still need to do. The other part of my personality is unhappy because there's so much more we need to do, but because of what has occurred, unforeseen obligations, labor settlements, and things of that nature, it's hard for me to argue for them at this point in time. The last contract that's going to come before us may not impact on fares and tolls coming up, but it certainly has had us reach into the cupboard and put ourselves at a position that I don't think anybody is comfortable being in. And I'm unhappy that the presidential panel, to a great extent, put us in that position. not having the responsibility of having to actually serve the entire region. It really put us behind the 8 ball, but we'll get through it. However, in order to get through it, we do need our funding partners to step up. And the state of New York in particular, we heard from the state controller about the $50 million of benefit from the settling that the cost would have been, and I'm sure there are plenty of estimates in terms of the importance to the state and the region of settling the strike or the proposed potential strike. There are great economic benefits for the region, for the city, the state, and we're going to need help in order to be able to deliver both services in the future and deliver and protect our capital plan going forward, something that the city and the state has pulled back from in the more recent past. I'll conclude my comments with the one thing I would hope that we can do as we approach a budget in January is that we put in service enhancements right in the budget so that we're not dealing with them as an add-on in July and having to find the plan, that we pick some number, 25, 30, $50 million, and put it right in there and begin trying to work towards that now. Because if you look at the amounts that we need to serve communities that still haven't been restored to prior cuts, new and growing communities, in the city and in the region, our tasks ahead of us are considerable, and it should not be an unfavorable for next July. We should be on target, and it should become part of our permanent plan. Thank you.
Metzger.
I'm hoping that everyone understands that this dialogue you've just had highlights one basic fact, which is we don't have enough money to fill all the buckets that are waiting to be filled. But I agree with Mr. Capelli that seeing the safety enhancements included when it was stressful to get them in, and seeing the service enhancements included when it was probably even more stressful to get them in, is appreciated, because it's very important for us to keep telling the people who use our services that our intention is to expand it. Speaking for myself and my own constituents, I think the older board members know that I've been rankled since before I was ever on this board that my county had a 3-hour outgoing service gap from 1 to 4 in the afternoon, which made it untenable for working parents to continue to use the train. I appreciate the support of the board and MTA and Metro North in lining up for that mid-afternoon train. I also appreciate the pilot study that's being done for parking. MTA tends to lockstep our toll increases and our fee increases, and the sense we all have is that that's a fair thing to do for the whole region. But just as we serve a diverse community with a diverse workforce, I might add, we have diverse economic realities throughout our region. And we face different types of competition. It makes perfect sense to me that MTA should try to level that competition field when we're dealing with it. I look forward to seeing how this pilot study works, and I'm hoping it is successful. But special thanks to all the board members who supported me in my quest for a mid-afternoon train. Thanks.
Mr. Ballin.
Thank you, Tom. Bob, in your executive summary, you talk about how funding the labor settlement causes us to divert some resources away from the long-term costs and liabilities. We've talked about this, and then you mentioned how we're suspending OPEB temporarily. What is the current OPEB? I realize it's out of context if you don't use the actuarial analysis. What's the current OPEB gap that we have? And A, and B, have you talked to the rating agencies about this?
What we pay is the current, retiree health care, and I believe that's about $450 million a year. If we were to fund it on an actuarial appropriate basis, like a pension plan, we'd be $2.5 billion. So it's a significant reduction and increasing. Our unfunded liability for OPEBs is $19.9 billion. I think that's the most recent estimate. You know, as you know, John, very few municipalities fund. It's very rare that they do. The city has funded it for a while. The state doesn't fund it. We've started to fund it. I think the rating agencies appreciate the fact that we are attempting to fund it, but I think they also recognize the realities. But I will say that it is something that they write up in their reports that it's a liability. And so, you know, if you read in the rating reports, you'll see them mentioning that, not just for us, but for others. But I think the fact that we're attempting to put money aside, and this was not something we wanted to do, this is kind of the, you know, the best of bad alternatives. So again, they know we want to keep funding it, but I think you're absolutely right to point out that this is a credit factor. But I think, as the rating agencies have said in, you know, one of the earlier reports, getting rid of the labor risk, which was probably the biggest risk to our financial plan, outweighs some of these other risks that, you know, we still have because they're long-term liabilities. Yeah.
Mr. Albert?
I wanted to say that riders really appreciate some of the service enhancements that are going in this, proposed to go in this budget. I'm sorry they're listed as negatives. I understand why they are, but
other changes.
Other changes is much better. Righting some of the wrongs of 2010, finally bringing the J train to Broad Street are things that riders are going to appreciate. And I think service improvements like the one proposed for Susan's county and others help the MTA in its quest to get partners in their capital plan funding and in other funding, because when you serve more areas, it seems to me it's tougher for people to say, well, they don't go where we want to go. There's still plenty of places that we can think of that the MTA should be serving and doesn't, but the fact that there's something in here when it must have been very difficult to put them in also helps riders feel like they're getting something for their extra fare hikes in 2015 and 2017. So thank you very much for doing that.
Ira?
Yeah, just to reiterate what everyone has been saying about we've got our funding partners, and that includes Albany. I think we would be remiss in not noting that just this past year, some money was removed from the TOA funds for purposes that are related to the MTA, but not something that's MTA. I mean, I think that has to be, it would be good to see a history of that. I know that's been done in good times and it's been done in bad times. And it hurts the MTA and especially hurts our capital program. So I think that's something we have to continually mention, that the MTA has been historically shortchanged. Bob, thank you for this presentation. It's real. I especially enjoyed the Volume 1, the short version, and then the more Talmudic Volume 2 for me to take home for my summer reading. Long Island Railroad Passengers certainly appreciate the restoration, especially West Hempstead service. It's great to see that we're at a point where we're coming back and we're expanding service on the Long Island Railroad, and especially also on transit. I didn't realize that the fare increase in 2015 is in March. I think towards that end we should start thinking about different things we can do and not wait. I know I waited too long. It was adjusting the age for family fare is one thing, and certainly something that the PCAC I know has talked about at length. Andrew certainly has, is expanding city ticket to off-peak daytime or even late night. I think that'd be a great thing to do if we could do it. I don't think there's a lot of cost. I know there's some ridership impacts in different places around the city. I still think we should look at it. We have in the transit agenda, there's an increase in service. There's a rearrangement in service. Actually, it doesn't cost anything. For southeastern Queens, I think that's an area that's terribly underserved. PCAC did a report about it several years ago, and I think the Long Island Railroad is well suited to provide service, especially in the off-peak. Thank you.
I'll have some closing remarks and then we'll vote. I'm very sensitive to the issue of service. I've heard it from a number of board members. We're in the business to provide service, but unfortunately none of our services operate at a profit. And so we do need to entertain what is the appropriate way to make sure that we are providing services that are needed, restoring services that we've cut, and provide new services in areas of the city that are going to see demographic change far beyond that what we've seen in the last 20 years. But I think staff and management at the MTA needs to do a better job, and I've already asked the agency heads to do this, to focus on a set of metrics that can be used, not in an absolute way, but in an informative way, so the board can make an informed decision as to where service needs to go and not. Because I think all of us know, as board members, it's fairly easy to cross the threshold one way, which is to add service. It's probably 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more difficult to cross back the other way. And when you're down to your last dollar, we need to make sure. But I do want to emphasize it's not equivalent across the board. We have knowingly, for 20 years, made decisions to subsidize express bus services to parts of our network that do not have rail service at a much lower fare box recovery ratio, and knowingly and willingly done that. So I'm not saying consistency, foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. No, that's not what I'm saying. But with a set of metrics, we can make informed decisions, and they won't be absolute. And I've already asked the staff to do that because I knew this day was coming. We've had discussions about what is more important, protecting the fare, protecting the service, and depending on the circumstances and depending upon where you sit as a board member, it may vary between the two. But you have a commitment from me that we'll bring those issues forward, and we'll try to provide information and make recommendations and seek board input and approval. Thank you very much. I think we now need to vote. The first is we've presented for informational purposes the preliminary budget in the July financial plan. And that's pursuant to the prescribed process we have. And now may I have a motion for board authorization for publishing of any required notices and the holding of public hearings necessary or appropriate in connection with those service investments that require a public hearing, and proceeding with the steps necessary to consider proposals for fare and toll changes, including the issuance of public notices and the holding of public hearings to elicit public comment on those proposals.
So moved.
Second? Any discussion?
Just a question. The latter part of what you just proposed, where it's mentioning toll and fare, we have already voted, I believe, at some point to have 2015 and 2017 fare hikes. So this is something else, correct?
No. The plan calls for those. You still need to go through the required steps of board approval for hearings, etc. And actually, the determination isn't final and approved until the board votes on it after the public hearings. So that's what we're seeking approval to go forward with the process under those circumstances. Do I have it right?
Yes.
Question, I'm sorry.
Yes.
In other words, we're voting now to have the public hearings on those fare
The
increases?
steps necessary, yes, to
For the
coordinate.
March?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, one last, I'm sorry, I didn't congratulate Bob Furran for squeezing every dime possible out of the MTA's budget. Thank you.
We've got a motion, second, and discussed. All those in favor? Aye. Thank you very much. I would now like to go into executive session pursuant to Section 105(1)(e) of the New York State Public Officers Law for matters relative to collective negotiations. May I have a motion? Second? All in favor? Aye.
Ladies and gentlemen, MTA Chairman and CEO Thomas F. Prendergast. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Any questions? Alfonso.
Hi, Tom. I'm almost afraid to ask this, but...
Thank you. Regarding the railroad unions, actually specifically the engineers union, which is still out, can you give me any sense on what the MTA's intention is there? Is a thought that you just offer them the same offer you offered all the other unions, or are things a little different with them because of all the work rules they have, that kind of thing?
Well, certainly, first of all, they're further behind in the process. They weren't part of the 8 that were in the coalition. But generally, the pattern that we have established now with the Long Island Railroad Coalition of 8 unions would be the basics. If there are minor differences here or there, and I'd leave that up to Anita, but for the most part, the pattern's being set or has been set by the Long Island Railroad Coalition Agreement.
what is the cost of just the LARR agreement through 2018?
If you saw the one chart that Bob Ferran had up there,
Just like, excluding Metro North?
yeah, I don't know what the exact number is, but embodied in that graph that showed how much the TW settlement would have been if it had gone across all the affected bargaining units. So part of the cost is included in that blue bar, and the other part of the cost is included in a portion of the red part of the bar at the bottom. If I remember correctly, 7,000 employees at Metro North, no, 6,000 at Metro North and 7,000 at Long Island Railroad? Just a little less. A little bit less, so it'd be prorated that way.
It's necessarily imprecise. Kate, you have a question? They don't seem to be working.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the replacements for the R32 and what happened with the cracked frames in Bombardier and how this might affect replacing the C trains and what the timeline is for that now?
Were you at CPOC? Did you hear the presentation at CPOC? We had a report on the R179s, I think, which is almost 300 cars. And, one of the initial things done is you build a prototype set of cars, and then you test those cars. And during the manufacture of those prototype cars, they found cracks on both the truck structure, that's the undercarriage that have the wheels and the axles, as well as the car body. They identified them before we did, and as a result of that, they had to find out what the root cause of the problem was in the manufacturing process, the welding itself. And so that has resulted in a 6 to 12 month delay in the delivery of those prototypes. Now, since that's the front end of the order, we're going to see, and they're going to see, if there are ways that they can accelerate the actual production of the cars after the prototype, the completion of the 300, and seeing if we can make up the time on that delay. And that would be the focus that we would have.
So does that mean, can you put a timeline on it if the Cs were going to be replaced in 2017? Are you still hopeful that you can maintain that timeline?
Well, I think at worst right now, as a result of that, it's 6 to 12 months, but it may be better than that. And the idea is to get them replaced as soon as possible because the 32s are the oldest cars in the Transit Authority fleet.
Is what happened with the cars similar to what happened with the Chicago Transit Authority and their rail cars that also came from?
I don't know. I know they had cracks in their car bodies, but I don't know if they were necessarily the same. Whether they're welding cracks or other types of cracks due to the manufacture of the steel. But I can't answer that question because I don't know exactly what the cause of the problem was in Chicago.
Jose?
Hi. The combined action teams, will that just be on the Lexington Avenue line? And can you discuss in brief the need for them?
I don't know if they're on just the Lexington Avenue line, and I'll defer to Carmen in a minute. But the idea is that as there have been concerns raised about the on-time performance in New York City Transit, as well as the subway weight assessment, which is the regularity of the delivery of train service against headway, they're looking at ways to be able to minimize the effects of delays. Ideally, you don't want any delays due to equipment failures, whether they be rolling stock, track, signals, or whatever, but they'll happen. So what they're doing is identifying specific resources that'll work as teams, and when a delay occurs, they'll go out and respond across all those disciplines. So you'll have track, you'll have signals, and you'll have other disciplines there with them so that they can troubleshoot the problem, restore the service as quickly as possible. Now, as far as whether it's just Lexington Avenue, I'll let Carmen answer that question.
Good afternoon. The priority behind doing this, or the real reason behind doing this, is to ensure that when we have a difficulty out there, that we have composite teams that are ready to go in and really help troubleshoot and fix the problem. So this team, like Tom said, will be comprised of track, signals, and third rail. So our general protocol would be to set, and this would be during the PMs, and these 4 teams would be strategically placed along the west side. And if we had a problem, we would typically in the past send out the signal group if it was a track circuit or something of that nature. If once they got out there they realized it was a track problem, we would then be waiting for the response from other teams. And of course that holds up service, and that's not what we want for our customers. So we're putting together these composite teams. They'll be out there, they'll be strategically placed during the PM rush, and they will be able to respond to many different types of issues and really cut down the amount of time that it takes to get to the root of a problem. Now, On the Lexington side, we're going to actually put out additional signal maintainers, both in the AMs and PMs. Again, same purpose, strategically placed on the line. Purpose being, when we have a problem, immediately be able to jump in there and address it. One of the most difficult times is, when the line's down, it's hard to get your technicians out to the site. So having them out there, having them strategically placed, is what we're trying to accomplish.
Hi. So the state controller said the MTA faces a $12 billion or more funding gap for its capital plan coming up. You said you wouldn't need to raise fares, or aren't going to be raising fares beyond what's already planned through 2017. What happens if the city and state, as you put it, don't belly up to the bar and contribute more resources for the capital plan you're about to put together? What would have to be paired from that, or how are you going to fund the money?
First of all, the statement that was made by a number of people, board member Pally as well as myself, is the collective bargaining settlements we have reached will not provide any additional pressure on the fare and toll increases that are scheduled in the financial plan. Point number one. Point number two, we are in the process of working on a finalized plan that we will bring to the board for their approval in September to submit to the Capital Program Review Board. And that plan will be scoped and sized with projects and with budgets by categories and elements, and it'll be the start of a dialogue with respect to getting approval by the Capital Program Review Board on that plan. So it'd be premature for me to state in any kind of detail what ifs. They're hypotheticals because we need to start a dialogue. And if there's one thing that has been done pretty consistently since 1982 and the first plan Dick Ravitch got was the focus and the importance of getting a plan that is appropriately sized for initially state of good repair, but then it moved into some level of system enhancements and service quality and then expansion. And so that dialogue will begin with the submission of that capital plan that is approved by the board in September. So it'd be premature for me to talk about it at this time.
So would you support raising fares to help finance that capital plan?
The responsibility of the board in terms of its fiduciary responsibility is making sure that it's got a balanced budget for the size of the services it delivers and its capital program. So there has to be a dialogue with respect to what the size of that program is and what the ability to fund it is. That's why it sounds like I'm playing games with you, but it's a premature discussion because we haven't had that dialogue yet. And when you get to the point where you have the size of a program outside of what our financial resources are, then that's part of the dialogue with the discussion with the other stakeholders, the city, the state, and other people about what finances they can bring to the table long before we talk about fares.
Along those lines, for this particular plan, was any consideration given, serious consideration, to restoring the initial fare increase, the 8%, the 8.5% that was discussed prior to that paring back from several months ago?
If you followed the dialogue, at least since the time of my predecessor, that's Joe Loda, through my time, we've been pretty specific in terms of a number of elements in the plan. And that was the biennial fare increases. At one time they were 7.5%, but I believe in 2013, I believe a year ago, we moved to the 4% because of pressure from the state to live within this 2% per year, as well as the news media saying the fare payers have done enough, we need to live there. So we basically have tried to stay within that envelope, and that was what the discussion was here.
But in terms of the negotiations with the labor unions recently, you had said that this would place pressure can grab that, potentially on capital spending, obviously, which is borne out in the plan today, but also on fares. So I'm curious, given the settlements that were reached, whether there was a discussion over the last several weeks about dipping into fares to some degree.
Well, in the testimony we provided in front of 2 presidential emergency boards, we tried to make sure people understood the intertwined nature of costs going out, especially on the labor front, and in terms of revenue sources we had. So we were pretty clear in those. We've talked about those, but at the end of the day, when we decided how we were going to fund these, and Bob Fran was pretty clear what we went toward. We went for the OPEB resources for retiree benefits, and a slight reduction on the pay-as-you-go capital, because that's what the board felt were the appropriate places to go to be able to fund those labor settlements.
To follow up on the capital program, we already heard mention of the comptroller's report of the funding gap. The labor deals are now reducing the capacity by another 1.5 billion. And then you have this MTA Reinvention Commission coming up. With all the stress on the capital program as you're developing a financial plan for it, is there going to be any appetite or any room to actually implement whatever the Reinvention Commission puts your way just shortly before you have to approve your next capital program?
Well, there's two elements that the governor asked us to take a look at in the Reinvention Commission. The primary element was making sure that we're making investments that dealt with climate change, and making sure that if we're bringing the asset up to a state of good repair, we're doing it in a way in which it's going to be able to withstand the next 100 years based upon those global changes in weather. We know New York Bay is, I think, 9 to 10 inches higher than it was at the time the original IRT was built, so we have to accommodate for that. So, and those additional costs to change standards to meet that higher requirement are incremental. So we will utilize those that information to make informed decisions as to how we scope those projects. So if you're doing a state of good repair project and you're going to rehabilitate a station or rehabilitate a vent shaft to change the design criteria to provide for 200-year storms instead of 100-year storms and provide for elevations that are a foot higher, those are reasonable decisions to make. By the same token, the other thing he's asked us to take a look at were the issues with respect to how we can make sure that as the demographic changes occur in the region at large, we're making decisions so that we're not having to fund brand new infrastructure as much as improve existing infrastructure to take care of capacity. And that's part of a dialogue we need to have with New York City as they decide where to put another 1 million people between now and 2035, and another 1 million people on top of that within the region. So it's less an issue of the information won't be valid in a constrained program. Quite the contrary, it will help us make informed, very, very focused decisions as to how to spend that money.
Pete, you had a question?
Yeah, Tom, the plan compared to previous years has very little in terms of like actual increased service. There's no shorter headways for subways, more frequent trains or anything along those lines. Can you explain why?
Well, the two examples you gave, the only way you're going to get that is with communication-based train control. So that's a capital program expense. And we've got one line with it already underway. We have another line that's being installed on. That's the number 7. And the only way we're going to be able to run trains at increased frequency, at least the major arteries that the network has, is with new technology signaling. So that's a capital program expense. The issue of, you heard the dialogue. The board is very concerned about making sure that we don't lose sight of what our primary objective is, which is to provide service. In some cases, restore services we cut, and in other cases, add additional service where demographics change. So, and that will be done on a case-by-case basis, year by year, depending upon what level of finances we have. And the board's been pretty clear about that, and at least in the time I've been in here, like a year and a half, they've been very focused on looking at money for service where we can add it or put new service in.
Last question, Michelle?
Hi. The payroll mobility tax revenues have been coming in under budget, and I just wanted to know if, how does that change your plans to potentially leverage off that revenue stream? I know that the MTA was working on that, looking into using that revenue stream to borrow off of it, and in particular, in light of the fact that the capital budget is already, the next capital budget is already looking at these holes of 1.5 billion and what the comptroller estimates as well. So doesn't that place additional pressure on that revenue stream?
I'll let Bob probably correct me if I say something wrong, but when someone says what we budget for PMT, it's a relatively new revenue source. It's been in place 3 years, 4 years, and there were projections based upon what the estimated revenues would be on the employment base, and then there were some reductions in some entities that were given relief on that. But whatever we've budgeted against, where there's a loss, we have to make up for it. But that's why we go through this whole budget process, looking at all the revenue streams, comparing them against costs, and seeing if we can get alignment among the two, between the two.
Thank you.
But what about borrowing against? I mean, the plan was to borrow against that revenue stream.
Bob, go ahead.
It's still about $1 billion. It's still about $1.7 billion of a revenue stream. So while $50 million, $60 million, $70 million is significant money and does have an impact, the $1.7 billion, and still growing, but growing at a lower rate, is certainly sufficient for us to bond against at a very, what we think would be a very good rating.
Okay. Thank you all very much. And please give your farewells to Matt Flegenheimer, who is going to be leaving us all after this. Heading to City Hall.